Hey everyone, thanks for joining us for another episode of the Left Hook podcast, where we give you our weekly hard-hitting political and news analysis of current affairs going on globally and in Australia. As always, I'm joined by my co-host, James Corral.
Jordie. Hey, going everyone? Yeah, sorry. Send money and weapons to Ukraine. My wife just bought a $4 million Bugatti. I want to add one to my collection as well, so if we get some of that taxpayer aid flowing still, that would be fantastic. Sorry, continue, Jordie.
Sorry, as I was saying, a little slip up there. Yeah. As I was saying, thanks for joining us. So on today's episode, we are going to be analysing the recent global telecommunications and digital outage that just took place and affected Australia. So James is going to be covering that, and I'm going to be looking at the recent allegations of thuggerish and illegal tactics taking place in Australia's CFMEU trade union.
Yes.
And also a review into the drone strike that killed a Australian aid worker, Zoe Franken. So
yes, of course.
But first, let's begin with the news in Australia of the outage that just happened.
So, as many people probably around the world may know at this stage, a couple of days ago, there was pretty much a global outage of Microsoft software systems. So this affected a wide variety of industries. So we had like hospitals, airports, retail. All these systems were downed in like a massive kind of a technical bug, so to speak. At the centre of this, so it was estimated that I think it's about 8.5 million Microsoft devices and systems were affected. At the heart of this is a little cybersecurity and intelligence company called Crowdstrike. So Crowdstrike, the purported cause of the outage is that Crowdstrike updated some dodgy software and supposedly there was some corrupted data and that caused a massive outage. So I think it was reported that Meta, like Facebook and Instagram, their systems were down internally for about 6 hours or so. As well as a host of other industries. And it was global. It was a global situation. So I need to preface this as well by saying that I'm not a particularly tech-savvy person. So like most people my age, I'm obviously pretty technologically literate.
You're not a boomer.
I'm not a boomer.
I
don't need to sit back and to touch my phone, with one hand and lower my glasses. But there is a lot of probably a few more technical details that I'm obviously not as clued in on the specifics. But so just to get to it, there's an interesting history of this company, Crowdstrike. So Crowdstrike was initially founded in 2011. Two of the guys that founded Crowdstrike, they both used to work at McAfee Security Software, founded by the infamous Giga Chad, John McAfee, who was quite a controversial figure in the kind of security intelligence world. And about 3 years ago, he was found dead via suicide, unfortunately, in his Spanish prison cell. Now, he was a very controversial figure. He ran for the Libertarian Party in the United States in some elections. And there seems to have been some kind of intelligence / cybersecurity ties to the whole situation. Some people, his wife included, I've seen an interview with his wife where she believes that his death wasn't a suicide. Anyways, that's a bit of a digression. Two of these gentlemen started a company called Crowdstrike. Now, I think it's important for us to understand the way these things work, not just in the military-industrial complex, but also in the cybersecurity and intelligence world, is that there is a consistent revolving door in Washington. This is the same in Australia as well. But there is a revolving door between policymakers, think tanks, and the big businesses that profit from the policies that are put in place by policymakers. So, for example, you find that lots of the time you have a politician that will be pushing a certain agenda, or a certain policy, or some laws, or repealing of some laws, environmental protections, for example, and then you'll find that person, they'll leave office, leave their political career, and they'll go on to get a very lucrative, employment contract on a board of one of these companies that profited heavily from said changes or said laws that they enacted. So this is pretty common. I think it's pretty widely kind of accepted legalized corruption in the Western world, in our beautiful Western liberal democracies. So it's important to understand the network that these companies are founded in and that they operate in first. So two of these gentlemen that founded Crowdstrike was Dmitry Alperovich and another gentleman named George Kurtz. They both worked at McAfee. Founded Crowdstrike, had some seed capital money. Within a year of its founding, they hired a former FBI official, Sean Henry, to lead a subsidiary company. That's interesting. So we'll come back to Sean Henry later, right? So Crowdstrike, since their inception, the thing that most people will know them for is their involvement in the DNC kind of Russian hacking allegations that was quite prominent around the time of the 2016 election of Donald Trump. So essentially, it was alleged, and this is actually a pretty complicated field of investigation and study, so I'm relying primarily on the awesome investigative research done by Aaron Marte from the Grey Zone. He's kind of one of the pioneers in groundbreaking this particular field. Pardon me. Essentially, what happened was it was alleged that some Russian hackers hacked into a DNC server and stole valuable polling information, which was then fed to Trump's presidential campaign, which allowed them to have an edge in essentially beating the Democrats at the polls. Now, some of our more liberal-minded listeners might think, well, of course, that makes perfect sense, because how on earth could, a disgusting, bombastic populist like Donald Trump, possibly beat in an election these incredible, sophisticated, technocratic Democrats who are just scions and paragons of virtue and principle and just pushing humanity forwards in the right direction, of course. So that was alleged. And this became a massive political story, and it took up a large part of Trump's first term as president. Obviously, all the investigations, impeachments, proceedings, all the other kind of mumbo-jumbo that was associated, and it was huge in the news cycle. And it obviously led to lots of the kind of rumours of, the Trump-Russia allegations, essentially. When this was being investigated by the FBI, it was found that the documents that they were allowed access to, obviously you're sifting through pages and pages of documents forensically, they were only restricted, what they could see was restricted to what Crowdstrike, who was hired to investigate the hackings as well, allowed them to see. And the FBI had any particular qualms or issues with this at the time. So Crowdstrike came up as a key player then. So essentially, they were showing the official investigators what they couldn't see, and essentially acting as a referee, maybe point them in any specific direction or omit certain information that could be damaging to the claims. So this essentially calls into doubt the whole conclusion of said investigation, and obviously kind of shows the integration and the interaction that companies like Crowdstrike have within this kind of amorphous political blob that exists in Washington, D.C. And in Virginia. Another couple times that Crowdstrike has come into the news headlines. One was in 2014. So there was, I think you probably remember this, the movie with Seth Rogen and James Franco about the two guys that break into, I think it was called The Dictator or something. Not The Dictator.
No, it wasn't The Dictator.
They break into North Korea for the interview.
Yes.
The interview for an interview with Kim Jong-un. And apparently, according to the Western media, this was very controversial in North Korea. And supposedly North Korea responded by hacking into Sony, Sony, the production company, their kind of online infrastructure and causing damage or whatever. This is all investigated by Crowdstrike again. Another time they were prominent in the news was in 2015, when essentially, and this is important to remember what was happening geopolitically at the time, because the United States had announced their policy shift away from the Middle East, and it was known as the pivot to Asia as a policy stance. So they were essentially wrapping up the forever wars in the Middle East, so you guys can deal with all the shit fuckery that we've created over here because we have bigger fish to fry in the Pacific. So, reading between the lines, we're done destroying the Middle East. We're going to set our crosshairs on China and East Asia, and that's going to be our military and geopolitical focus from now on. So that was around the same time as this happened. That was, again, 2014-ish, so around the same time as this Sony hacking allegation as well. But Xi Jinping and Barack Obama met and had an official conference discussing, I think they agreed to not commit espionage against each other. So I think it was, obviously they're still both committing espionage against each other,
yeah.
But I think it was kind of a goodwill political gesture, obviously, to kind of save face. And around this time, Crowdstrike reported quite publicly that there were Chinese hackers that had hacked into a bunch of US pharmaceutical and technology firms as well. And that was quite public, obviously, as well. So then that therefore served as undermining these kind of, because it was all around the same time, this served as undermining the this agreement that Obama and Xi Jinping had come to. So again, just some interesting little tidbits to note to add to the story. And that undermined the position that was being taken publicly by both administrations, essentially. However, the cherry on top of this delicious information dessert that we're sharing with our audience here is that the Chief Security Officer, Sean Henry, who was hired by the two founders from the FBI, he, 3 days before the outage, sold $1.45 million worth of Crowdstrike shares. That bloke is a stock trading genius. He is up there with Nancy Pelosi as being some of the best traders of all time.
The GOATs.
How fortunate is that?
I'll just add, I had a look that Pelosi didn't sell her shares, so maybe she didn't. No. She didn't catch the memo, and she lost about $150,000.
Really?
Correct. Yeah, she might be slipping.
Sean should have bloody given her his given her shared his notes to them. Maybe. My goodness. But that puts a weird perspective on the whole situation.
Is it coincidence?
Is it coincidence? Look, I'm never going to rule out coincidence.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you think that has to indicate some prior knowledge, which would not only be insider trading, classified as insider trading, which I believe is illegal, However, everyone does it, obviously, but it's still officially illegal. But that would also indicate foreknowledge that something catastrophic like this was going to happen. It was going to affect, these systems worldwide. And, people could have this affected hospitals, airports, transport, retail. People could have potentially died as a result of this.
And it shut down a major portion of the global economy, really.
Yeah, exactly. And it has massive consequences.
Yeah, it does.
But old mate made a hefty chunk of coin on it.
Yeah, he did.
So good on him. Props to you, sir. A very good job. And to me, it really kind of demonstrates the fragility of this whole cloud-based centralized system that we live in. Actually, it's important to note as well, back to the previous point of the kind of revolving door of intelligence agencies and security apparatus and politics that seems to form this kind of amorphous blob that seems to dictate policy inside the United States and therefore trickle down to Australia as well. For example, even the really kind of the inception of the kind of Silicon Valley, the startup, entrepreneur tech companies, finance tech, security tech. In the late 90s, as this industry was starting to boom, one of the big venture capital firms that did put lots of money into lots of these startups and projects was Incutel. Now, Incutel was a company that was a venture capital firm that was actually founded by the CIA in 1999. So it was a way that they could obviously fund and do R&D, research, technology development, not under the official CIA umbrella. Quite similar to, for example, the Iran-Contra affair, where, selling weapons to Iran and, facilitating cocaine being sold in the United States was a way to fund certain activities, a way to fund the Contras, for example, and other things that they wouldn't be able to get congressional approval for officially on the books. So it's a multi-layered cake here.
Yeah.
And that was the cherry. That was the little glacé cherry on top.
Yeah.
Another interesting little just point to note that I found was interesting is this actually reminded me of the Stuxnet computer virus, which I think was around 2010. I remember seeing it on the news, but it was the first time that there seemed to have been a global kind of, it seemed to be entering the public zeitgeist that, and this is, 14 years ago, but as we move towards a more centralized, technology-driven future, the fragility of that, and the vulnerabilities that arise from that, and that was a big focus of kind of the news that was Stuxnet. So it was essentially kind of a computer virus, like a computer worm that was, had supposedly been unleashed, and there was lots of talk in the news about how it could potentially be damaging. Didn't really affect anything here in Australia. However, it did reportedly damage Iran's nuclear facilities. Now, that's awfully convenient because it turns out that although neither of these countries have ever taken accountability for it or announced anything officially, most kind of investigations and reports on it reveal that this was created as a joint project by the United States government and the Israeli government, because they had under a code name Operation Olympic Games or something like that, and it was essentially directed at Iran's nuclear weapons facilities or their nuclear technology facilities, shall we say. So that's another little tidbit to add, just some food for thought for our listeners, and for myself and for yourself. But I think, again, the main thing that we can take away from it is the more that we get digitalised and centralised, and the more we become a cloud-based society, the more vulnerable the entire system is, the more it can be exploited by actors, whether they're private actors, whether it's state actors, and the more vulnerable the public is at the end of the day. And especially, again, we consider the point that, this outage here, people could have died as a result of that.
That's right.
And that's scary.
And the more, I guess, the responsibility for running these things comes down to corporations with links to intelligence agencies.
Yes.
And when those slip-ups and mistakes happen, as we possibly saw with COVID, that the ramifications are absolutely huge.
Absolutely massive, yeah. And at the end of the day, the more that this gets outsourced to corporations, their main goal is to make money, profits, and the shareholder profits, and the ability for shareholders to sell $1.45 million worth of shares before they crash. But that is the primary concern and directive of these organisations. So again, if it's getting to a stage where more and more the very infrastructure that runs our day-to-day lives is essentially controlled by companies that are there to make a profit from it, well, where does that leave the consumers? And also, what role does that leave for states? And how do states respond to this, essentially? And what is more powerful, the corporation or the nation state?
Yeah, and it's not going to be the last time something like this happens. So,
not the first and not the last.
No.
Now, speaking of corporations being more powerful than nation states, Jordie, what's happening in Australia, mate, a bit closer to home?
So last week, allegations came out. So it was a report done by 9 News Australia that the CFMEU, a Australian trade union, was...
probably our strongest trade union.
So, I'll get to that. It's one of our strongest trade unions. Was... So basically, they've been accused of standover kind of thuggish tactics and links to organised crime. The report said that there was up to 20 members that either were in or had direct links to bikie groups here in Australia. And look, let's be honest, it in some ways comes as no surprise.
No, definitely not. Definitely not.
The CFMEU has always had kind of a shady image to it.
It has.
And as an interesting little anecdote, you actually went past the headquarters one time here in Australia and...
I just so happened to be driving past, and there were about 6 dudes out the front, all with neck tats, mullets, pretty friendly looking characters. I don't know what association they have with anything.
It was probably just a coincidence.
But I think it is important to remember as well what role trade unions play.
Okay, so I'm getting up to that. But what I was going to say, it should come as no surprise, obviously, because of that. There's been allegations in the past. Their image can, be seen as a little bit thuggish.
Yeah.
But history's shown the Teamsters in America had direct links to the mob. Mm-hmm. And what needs to be, I think, observed and looked at, though, is the way that this will undermine the union movement and the Labor Party. Mm-hmm. So the CFMEU has 140,000 members here in Australia. Yep. Their role is to fight for better working conditions and better pay for said members. So this is going to fracture and destroy this union, and is one of the most powerful and influential unions in the construction industry. Yeah. So, and that's going to directly affect everyday tradies like you and myself. Yeah. So that's one thing to point out. And it also comes as another kind of angle for the attack dogs within the right-wing press, especially at the Australian. and Murdoch's newspapers, and for the Liberal Party to use this story to undermine the Labor Party and to weaken its support and funding basis, which is trade unions.
Well, how did the Labor Party respond to this, by the way?
So they responded how you would expect they would respond. Yep. They instantly took the allegations as very serious. They forced a independent inquiry because the CFMEU said that they were going to do an internal inquiry. Mm-hmm. The Labor Party said we're not having any of that. Yep. And obviously they were forced into a corner. What else did they have to do? Yep. And in some ways it's good. I think we shouldn't have thuggish trade unions. No. It's not good.
I agree.
We should obviously have honest trade unions that work for their members.
Yep.
And the Labor Party has pushed for an independent inquiry, and they've cut all ties to the CFMEU, which is interesting because running to the run-up of the previous election, the Labor Party received $1 million from the CFMEU. Yep. So they're a large donator to the Labor Party. Yep. This is going to weaken the Labor Union and the Labor Party.
Of course.
And this is coming up to a possible election next year. Yeah. So we've seen now that Dutton has pushed his nuclear proposal. Mm-hmm. He's going to use that as a referendum. And now we have these big allegations of the thuggish culture and somewhat allegations of criminal culture within the CFMEU. But then that kind of then gets pushed into the union movement at large. Yes. And now there's reports coming out that members of the Labor Party at a state and federal level knew about this. They knew not the links to organised crime per se or any outright illegal connections, but they knew that there were things going on within the trade union, within the CFMEU, that could have been a little bit sketchy, and they're saying that they have turned a blind eye to it. So these things will be perfect ammunition for the Liberal Party to use coming up to the next election.
Yeah, well, this has dominated the news cycle.
It has,
for the last probably a week and a half or 2 weeks or so. I think it's very important to note that Australia does have a very strong history of union movements.
It does.
And it is why, one of the reasons why ordinary working class people in Australia do have an awesome standard of living comparatively to the rest of the world.
Correct, that's right.
That will always be a threat to big business, obviously.
And it will be.
And I would actually think, if I may, may make a point, what's really important to remember is that big business... big finance, construction companies, real estate developers, and the Liberal Party have never had any sort of connections to criminal or shady behaviour.
No.
They are all just completely stand-up citizens, all completely law-abiding.
Yeah, clean as a whistle.
Clean as a whistle. Yep. Never broken a single law.
No, of course not.
And I think that's really important to remember when we demonise these thuggish trade unions.
That's exactly right, yeah.
I also think it's important to point out that the majority of trade union members in Australia, because we do have many trade unions, many workers' unions, the majority of them are probably 55-year-old mums that work in packing facilities. Let's be completely honest.
That's right,
Not every trade union member is a neck-tattooed
of course not,
brandishing a baseball bat at a dweeby property developer.
No, of course not. It's interesting because a story came out just a few months ago that for the past year, they have found that a lot of organised crime, specifically coming out of Asia, the proceeds of said crime has been going into the property industry. So
really?
Yeah, so if you say you're a multi-millionaire or billionaire overseas, or you are a nefarious actor and you have lots of illegal money, it's very easy to park it into the Australian property market.
Of course.
And that has also led to increased prices.
Oh, of course. Yeah.
And it was interesting to see.
Who profits from these alleged illegal funds going into the property market? Would that be property developers and
Property
banks?
developers,
Banks,
major,
make an inference.
major investment firms that invest in the Australian property market.
And I imagine if we were just to be completely hypothetical, that total amount of money, which is probably in the
hundreds of millions,
billions of dollars, probably. That would be far exceeding whatever money was involved in any sort of corrupt dealings involving the unions.
And then, as I said, the CFMEU are responsible for the working conditions and the pay of 140,000 Australians. So you've got to take that into account.
Of course.
And this is also, I think, interesting to look back at the decreasing rate of trade union membership in Australia. So in the 1980s, about 40% of people were registered in a trade union. So it's the 1980s. 40 years later, it's now down to about 12 or 13%.
Wow.
It's a massive drop.
Yeah.
And that has also coincided with a wage stagnation of 30 to 40 years.
Do you reckon that's a causation or correlation, Jordie?
It's hard to say.
Yeah.
Very hard to say.
Yeah.
But I would lean towards possible causation.
Yeah. Well, that makes sense. And I think as well, like you said, it's perfect ammunition for big business and the business lobbies, which are ostensibly represented by mainstream media and even like the ABC, for example. And that's perfect ammunition for them to attack organised labour.
That's right. And it's kind of it's also in some ways a nail in the coffin of any actual major housing reform.
Of course.
Because it is also the trade unions that have to work alongside that housing reform to make sure that the industry is actually working for the workers and for people that want to buy a home as well. And it's not just being used to profit property developers and organised crime.
Well, that's terrifying. So do you think the CFMEU will survive?
No. So they've gone into administration in Victoria and in Queensland.
Goodness.
And no, there's no way that the Liberal Party or the Labor Party now are going to stand by, or the ACTU, the Australian Council of Trade Unions, are going to allow the CFMEU to keep proceeding as it was.
Yeah.
There's going to be an entire overhaul in the organisation, and it will weaken the organisation, because I guess also young tradies coming into industry going to have seen these stories, and they're probably not going to want to join it either.
No, of course.
It destroys their reputation and tarnishes it. But within saying that, if these are true, these allegations, and it seems that there's some credibility to them. Of real thuggish intimidation and connections to bikies, that should be stamped out.
No, absolutely. I completely agree.
But I guess that's just kind of the minor part of it. When you look at the larger picture, it is just going to weaken the trade union movement and weaken the Labor Party.
Yeah, weaken the organised labour, which is terrifying.
And what I'll say as well is that the more the union movement is weakened and broken up, which is the support to the Labor Party, the more the Labor Party moves to the right and has to get funding from property developers and corporate Australia. So that's just kind of the larger picture of what's really going on, I believe.
So we're probably going to be, the result of this is that maybe in 10 years' time, we'll be looking a lot more like the UK or the United States, for example.
And I think this is somewhat anecdotal. Obviously, we both have worked within the construction industry. Yeah. You also see, as trade unions are weakened, you get more and more competing labour, foreign labour. That's not tarnishing people that want to come here and work hard, but also it drops the working conditions and the pay rates for everyday construction workers and tradies. Yeah.
Well, hopefully we'll still be able to maintain a decent standard of living over the next upcoming decades. However, I feel like this might be something that will be a serious impediment to that, I think, in the long run.
Yeah, definitely.
And that is terrifying. Well, look, in the face of that kind of grim and depressing news, do you have any kind of lighthearted stories that you'd like to finish on today, Jordie?
No, this is not particularly lighthearted.
All right. Well, just tell me what you've been...
So 100 days have passed since the assassination of Zomi Frankham, who was an Australian aid worker who was working for the World Central Kitchen in Gaza, delivering much-needed aid and medicine to people in need. And what happened is that the Israeli Defence Force launched several drone attacks on the Envoy. There was 3 drone attacks on, I believe it was 3 cars. To begin with, they got out of one car, went into another. They then targeted the second car and then finally a third car. So it was a deliberate ongoing attack. This wasn't just a coincidental mistake.
Yeah.
And she was killed,
Yeah.
an Australian aid worker from Victoria, and alongside that, 6 other people.
I believe there was also a British national.
Yes,
as well.
yeah, that's right. So there was 6 other international aid workers that were killed alongside her.
Yeah.
And so there was a investigation put forward here in Australia that the Labor Party wanted to do. So the investigation was tasked as to find independently what had happened, independently of the Israeli government.
Of course.
So what is interesting is that leading the investigation was Mark Binskin, who was the ex-defence chief, who now works for BAE Systems.
Yes.
Funny enough, when he was defence chief,
Yeah.
BAE Systems was awarded several defence contracts.
Yeah.
And then after he stepped down, he went straight into the board and got a cruisy position. So
Wow, that
once
ties
again,
back to what we were talking about earlier.
correct. Just shows you the revolving doors between kind of, I guess, the defence industry government and corporations. So basically, what we kind of want to take away from this is that what the investigation has found is that the Israeli investigation was perfectly fine, that there was no issues with it, that it was a genuine and honest mistake.
Yeah.
And it's going to basically just be used as kind of, I guess, a soft landing for the Israeli government.
Yeah.
Is that there was no malice, there was no ill intentions, that her murder, which was an assassination.
Yeah.
That might be my opinion in some ways, but
So the Israeli government's position is that it was a tragic accident.
it was a tragic accident. Apparently, there was a Hamas militant that came out of a warehouse that they said had possibly went into this envoy that they targeted.
Yeah.
But on top of the cars were clear markings that it was an aid envoy. And after the first car was attacked, they then kept targeting and attacking the envoy itself.
And they also, as well, I believe, and you'd probably be able to correct me, that they also informed the IDF beforehand
Correct.
of their
Yes.
location and the time they were going to be entering.
That's exactly right. Yep.
So can we conclude that the Israelis maybe assumed that they were a bunch of Palestinian school children and therefore had a right to drone strike them?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, they were completely in the clear.
That's fair enough, yeah.
But what's really fascinating about this is that the weapons company that manufactured the drones that killed Zomi is a company by the name of Elbit Systems.
Yep.
So it's an Israeli weapons company,
Yep.
but it has a subsidiary here in Australia.
Interesting.
On the board of the Australian company
Yeah.
are many Israelis that have direct links back to Elbit in Israel. And this company here in Australia has been receiving money straight from the Australian government, up to $3 million from the Australian Super Fund.
That's interesting.
Yeah. So it kind of shows you the way that public money is invested into these weapons companies. And then those weapons, all that money, then finances other companies completely directly involved in conflicts and in the slaughter in Gaza at the moment.
Yes, and also as well, to me, this actually really personally makes me quite angry. We were joking around earlier to the audience, but this makes me really angry because you literally have an Australian citizen who's an aid worker
Yep.
who is probably deep down inside themselves a better human being
Than most of us.
than
Yep.
Probably most of us,
Definitely.
like everyone watching, us included, and they've been deliberately killed
Yep.
by a foreign government,
Yep.
and there's no recourse for that.
No, there's none whatsoever. And the investigation is just going to provide a soft landing for the Israeli government, that it was a complete mistake, and it's going to absolve them of any responsibility for Zomi's death.
Ooh, and the Australian government is fine with that conclusion?
Because it's an independent investigation. It's not done by the government. It's done by a ex-Defence Force chief and now a sitting board member on BAE Systems.
Of course.
Yeah.
So if we can relate that to an earlier point, it's like the CIA investigating themselves for the trafficking of cocaine into America and assuming and coming to the conclusion that the CIA had nothing to do with this.
Yeah, that's
That would be
exactly
correct.
That's exactly right.
Well, that's actually disgusting.
It is.
That's truly
And
disgusting.
I'll be honest, the moment I saw who was leading the investigation, and I just had no faith in the investigation really to begin with, that they were actually going to hold Israel to account.
Yeah.
So
Well,
that is sad to see.
That is sad to see. And correct me if I'm wrong as well, the whole reason that particular organisation, which is World Central Kitchen, I believe, the whole reason they started doing these, aid drops and aid deliveries was because UNRWA
Yes.
was defunded
Yep.
and stopped getting their funding from the same Western nations.
Correct. That's right, including Australia.
That are backing Israel.
Yep.
And then so as a replacement, the people that went to deliver aid were then killed by that same government.
Exactly right.
Well, that's horrible.
It is horrible.
That's horrible.
Yeah.
I think all lives are equal.
Yeah, of
whether
course.
They're Palestinian, Israeli, Australian, American, whatever. But I think there should really be a responsibility on our government.
Of course.
To maybe put some pressure or maybe do something about this. But there probably won't be. That's what you're saying.
No, there won't be because of the Israel lobby here in Australia, and I guess that, as we have talked about, the deep web of connections between intelligence agencies, the government, and the military-industrial complex, and I guess the ever-growing military-industrial complex here in Australia, and the way the public money is funding weapons that go into these wars that commit atrocities and the kickback on the death of Australians as well. Yeah.
Wow.
So,
well, that was some good news to end.
It's a rough note to end on, but it's a good news. So,
I think it's important to note that despite all these horrible things coming out of the occupied Palestinian territories, there still hasn't been any cessation in fighting.
No.
Any cessation in the slaughter. So I think it's also important for everyone watching to remember that even though the news cycle goes on, that is still happening, and we should all bear that in mind and keep applying pressure where we can.
Yep.
I think.
On that rather bleak point, I think we should probably wrap up the episode. And there's been a finding by the ICJ over the weekend, so we should probably look at that on our next episode.
Absolutely.
But thanks for joining us once again on another episode of the Left Hook podcast.
It was a bit of an emotional roller coaster of an episode, but yeah.
Yeah, please like, subscribe, leave some comments. Hateful comments. Positive, constructive, any will do. And we will see you next week. Thanks so much.
See you next week, guys. Thank you.